Now, to officially start the summit, I will now turn you over to our first speaker. Our first speaker is a futurist, online presenter, conference speaker, author, disruption, talent, leadership, the future of work consultant. GIHAN gives you a glimpse into what's ahead and shows you how to become fit for the future in your professional and personal life. Since 1997, he has worked with business leaders, thought leaders, entrepreneurs, and other change agents, helping them with their strategy for thriving in a fast changing world. He is the author of The Future of Leadership, Disruption by Design, and 10 other books. GIHAN is one of Australia's leading online presenters and has been running online presentations since 2009. Let's all welcome Mr. GIHAN PERERA.
Thanks very much, and it's really great to be here. It's a thrill to be here as part of this first virtual summit. And of course, there are some positive things with virtual, and there's some downsides as well. So let's make the most of the positive aspects of the virtual summit, which of course means that it's opened up to a really international audience. And what I want to do in the hour that we've got together is give you a little bit of a glimpse into what the future holds for us broadly, but also specifically for us as leaders, whether we're leading an association, whether we're leading a business, whether we're leading our family and community. Let's have a look at what leading in uncertainty is going to look like for our foreseeable future, and even for our unforeseeable future. So if 2020 has taught us anything, it's this, that we have to be willing to expect the unexpected. So you may remember that story about a butterfly flapping its wings on one side of the world, and then it's caused a hurricane on the other side of the world. Well, this is true, and this has happened. So that's a mathematical theory, but it happens in practice as well. And of course, for many of us, there's been so much disruption, so much change in so many ways that now we have to be willing to expect that even our future is going to have a lot of unexpected things in it. And I want to also make the point that it hasn't affected everybody in the same way. So you sometimes hear people say we're all in the same boat, and I don't think that's true. I think we're all in the same storm, but each of us has our own little boat that we have to navigate through that storm. And you can't always judge what boat anyone's in just by looking at them, because some people are in a very comfortable position, depending on what industry you work in, what your family circumstances are, whether you've got elderly parents to be looked after, and some are in a not so good position. And so just keep in mind that one of the most important lessons for us, for all of us as leaders, is to understand that everybody isn't in the same boat. We just happen to be in the same storm, navigating our way through that. So my rules of engagement for all my presentations, I've got 3 basic rules. And actually, I think this applies not just for my presentation, but I'm going to recommend these as rules that you keep in mind for everybody that you hear in the next couple of days through the rest of the conference. So the first one is I want to give you some ideas to think about and maybe change your thinking in a few different areas about looking into the future. The second thing is, and Charlie mentioned this earlier, have some fun. So be a bit playful. So we will definitely stop during my presentation for you to ask me questions. So if you've got questions, type them in the chat, ask the questions in Q&A, and I'll stop as we go through to answer your questions. If there aren't any questions, then I'll just keep going. But if you've got questions at any time, type them in the chat, type them in the Q&A, and I will answer them for you. But I want to go further than that. So I've got some questions for you. We're going to run a couple of polls. I've got some puzzles for you. So there's a chance for you to engage by being a bit playful, and do that not only for your own benefit, but it actually helps everybody else in the room as well if you're playful and you fully engage. Because sometimes listening to me answer somebody else's question might be really valuable for you as well. And of course, this applies to all the other speakers in the session as well. And the last thing is I really want you to get some practical things that you can take away from not just my presentation, but the whole summit. I've seen the programs, a fantastic lineup of speakers. So there's some really practical things that you can take away and put into action in your leadership role. Let me tell you a story. And so I'm in Australia. I live in Perth in Western Australia. And this is a photograph that I took a few years ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, when I was on the other side of Australia in Sydney at the Qantas domestic terminal at Sydney Airport, getting ready to fly home to Perth. And I saw this sign that was the advertising in the airport, and it was an ad. They were advertising GoToMeeting. So this is before Zoom became really popular. And I took that photograph because I thought, isn't this really interesting that here's Qantas advertising for one of its biggest competitors. So Qantas, of course, didn't see it that way. So if you think about the Philippine equivalent of that, this would be like Philippine Airlines advertising for Cebu Pacific or something like that, right? And Qantas would never allow one of its competitors like Virgin Airlines to advertise in the Qantas terminal, but they were happy to take advertising from GoToMeeting because as far as they were concerned, they just saw GoToMeeting as a really useful tool for some of their passengers, for some of their members to use in business. But when you think about it, GoToMeeting and now Zoom and WebEx and Teams, what they do is they bring business people together who don't live close to each other for meetings. And isn't that what airlines do as well? So really, GoToMeeting was a competitor for Qantas, but they didn't see it that way. And in fact, I've shown this photograph over the last few years to audiences and clients, and I told the story and said, what do you think? And most of them, until this year, most of them said, yeah, look, that's kind of interesting, GIHAN, but it's, you know what, it's not such a big thing because who could ever imagine a time when everybody would stop flying to business meetings and we'd all be meeting online, right? But that's exactly what's happened. And so this is one of the biggest changes that's happened. It's not just about airlines and online meetings, it's that everybody is thinking differently about what matters to them and what's important to them. So as we go through and as we're thinking about agility, that word for the theme for this conference is perfect because we have to be agile because what used to work might not work anymore. So here are the three things I want to talk about today when we're talking about the future of leadership and leading with agility. First, I want to show you how to scan wider. So think more about what's happening outside your area, around your business, your association, even your family or community. How do you look wider at what else might be happening in the world? The second thing is then how do you narrow it down to choose the path that you're going to take for the future? Because we obviously can't do everything. We have to choose. So how do we make those choices and how do we make wise choices? And the last thing is how do you leverage and make use of the resources that you've got? And one of the things I'm going to say is that when you're starting to do your planning and you're starting to look at the future, you're not looking for something that's perfect. So for many people, many businesses, many associations, at the start of the pandemic, you had to throw out all your plans. And now when you're starting to do your planning again, metaphorically, it might look a little bit like this, like a child's drawing. It's not going to be one of those beautiful sketches that I just saw that Maria got. It may be something that's very basic. So when you're creating your plan, you're not looking to create something that's perfect, or you're not looking to create something that's perfect. What you want to do is create a plan that's good for you for now, but make sure that you've got backup plans so that when things change, then it's easy for you to switch to one of those backup plans. So don't think that you're going to get it perfect because you're not, because the world is still changing and it's changing quite fast. And the other thing I want to say is that, we're talking about the future of leadership today, and I'm going to one of the benefits of having this virtual conference is that we can, and we do have people from all around the world who are attending today. So I'm going to give you some examples that are specific to the Philippines, but I'm aware that there are people from other parts of the world as well. So some of the examples are more broad and they'll apply anywhere in the world, not just in the Philippines. And for the same reason, even though we're talking here, and a lot of the sessions at this conference are specifically for associations and association executives, because I'm talking about the future of leadership, I want to go broader. And 2020 has shown us that we need to be leaders in all parts of our lives. And you might be a leader in your association, you might be a leader in a business, you might be a leader in your family, you might be a leader in your community. And it doesn't matter whether you've got the word leader on your business card, it's still important for all of us to step up and be leaders now. So everything I'm going to talk about today is really around business and associations, but I reckon you can find that it will work just as effectively for you if you think about leadership in other parts of your life. Okay, that's the introduction bit. Let's get into these three areas. So the first one is, how do you scan wider? So how do you look further at what's happening outside your area of expertise, what's happening outside your association, what's happening outside the Philippines, what's happening outside your area of control, because that will have an impact on you. So I'm going to show you part of this process called scenario planning. Scenario planning is kind of a bigger process than this. I'm not going to go through the whole process, but I'm going to show you one specific part of it. Now, because I'm talking to leaders, I'm sure there's some of you who've already done scenario planning and you understand what this is. But if you haven't come across scenario planning, let me tell you briefly what it is. So it started in Shell, the petroleum company in the 1970s. The Shell management and the board said, we're not sure what our future is going to be like. So they took three men and put them in a room, and they said, do some analysis of what's coming up in our future, and then come and tell us so that we can plan. And so these three men went away and they looked at things that might be happening in the future. So at the time, in the 1970s, they looked at scenarios like, what if Jimmy Carter becomes president of the US? What happens if there's a war in the Middle East? What happens if the OPEC countries constrain the supply of oil? What does that mean for our business? So they looked at all these scenarios and they figured out which ones are likely, which ones are less likely. They put probabilities next to them. And then they went to the senior management and they said, here it is. And the management said, this is fantastic. Which of these is going to happen? And they said, no, that's not the way this works. What we've given you is a range of scenarios, and now you have to choose one of them, which you think is the most likely, and that's going to be your plan A, but maybe you've also got this plan B, C, and D as backup plans. So this process that I'm going to share with you is one part of scenario planning. And when I do this process with clients, I do this part for them so that I do the scanning wide for them. But I'm going to teach you this process, which will be really useful for you to do. And I suggest that you do this with your executive team in the association. If you're in a business, I reckon you should do it with your business team, and in fact, with everybody in your team as well. So this process is called pestle analysis. And pestle is just a word with 6 letters, and each of the letters means something. You might have done this before, or you might have done a thing called steep analysis. So steep is the previous version of it. That has only got 5 letters. So pestle is the next version. So pestle analysis is a process that goes through these 6 external environmental factors. And the first one is political. So what's happening politically that could have an impact on your business or your association. The next one's environmental. So these are things like climate change, sustainability, a global pandemic. What are the impacts of that going to be on our association, our business, our community? The next one's all around people. So what are the social or sociological impacts? So all around the world, including in the Philippines, there are younger people entering the workforce. There are people who want different work styles. There's working from home and so on. Technology is one that everyone gets obsessed about, and that's true. You should think about technology, but don't forget the others as well. The next one is L, so legal. So what are the laws and regulations that might be changing, that might affect your association or your business? And the last one is economic. So what's happening economically that might have an impact? So what happens if there's an economic downturn? What happens if some industries are affected? What happens if there's a global recession? What does that mean for you and your association, your business? So I'm going to go through and give you some of the trends that are going to apply. And again, I'm going to make this quite broad, so it applies not just to the Philippines, but everywhere around the world as well. So I'm going to go through these trends, and then I'll stop and ask if you've got any questions. And you can ask me questions about those trends, or you can ask me questions about this process, this pestle analysis process, because I think that the reason I'm sharing this, first of all, I want to share some trends because it's really useful for us as leaders to understand the trends. But the second reason is that I want you to learn enough about this process that you can then take it and use it with your executives or with your leadership team or your teams in your organizations. Okay, so let me go through some of the trends, and I'm only going to do them very quickly, but you'll see some of the things that are going to affect us in our future. Okay, so things like the really obvious one that's happened to a lot of people in offices have now been forced to go to working from home. I think the Philippines has a big advantage here because in the Philippines, that idea of working away from an office has been part of culture, and it's been much more mainstream than it has been in some other countries. So you've got an advantage there because working from home is not only about working from home, but it's about being independent and autonomous and being reliable and trustworthy and all of those things. It's not just about the workplace. And I think in the Philippines, many people have been doing that for a long time now and understand how to make that work. But there's some consequences to that. So people who are now working from home and they're finding there are a lot of distractions because there's family and pets. There people are like, this is actually a Philippines company that created this foldable thing called Box Office, where you can create in your home, if you don't have a private space, you can create this private space for you to be able to work from home. The idea of working from home can be extended to working from anywhere. So because it doesn't only have to be the office and home. And many Western countries, like here in Australia, lots of people are working from home for the first time and they love that. They don't want to do it full time, but they also don't want to go back to the office full time. But also they can work from anywhere else as well. And the companies like Siemens, who have already said to all of their staff around the world in 40 or 50 countries that you can work away from the office 2 to 3 days a week, even from now. And so from now, it's mostly working from home, but in the future, it can be working from anywhere. And it's a real mindset shift that's required. And I think the Philippines has done this, is already ahead of this, just as much as is true with global teams as well. I'll mention something coming up about time zones, but again, there are many people in the Philippines who are already part of a global team. And the fact that you don't have to be in the same office is an advantage. And many people around the world are only just recognizing it. In the Philippines, you've been doing it for decades now. So there is an advantage. And there are many reasons why the Philippines is going to be a really important player in the future. Okay, I've taken the working from home one and I've gone into a lot of detail. I won't do the same for everything else, but let me just go through some of the others. So of course, we're hearing a lot of positive talk about vaccines and the ability to have really effective vaccines, but it'll still be at least the end of 2021 before we have enough vaccines and roll it out to all the world till we're absolutely sure that COVID's not going to go through the rest, not going to continue and not going to survive. But there are other things like rapid testing. So airlines are really keen on this, to be able to test people quickly and get a result in 5 minutes. So some of that rapid testing exists at the moment, but it's unreliable. But imagine if you were boarding an airplane, as much as you go through a security line, you can also go through a COVID-19 test line. And if you can get your results almost immediately, that changes the way that travel can happen. And we heard from Philippines Tourism Board just how important that is, like tourism is to the Philippines. And this could be a game changer before we have vaccines everywhere. Climate change is really important around the world, but particularly in the Philippines. And the three biggest hurricanes in history have hit the Philippines. The Philippines are unfairly burdened by this because if you look at your carbon footprint versus against the impact of climate change, that's an issue. Let's look at other things like there's some of the people things. So we're looking now by 2050, we're going to have another 2 billion people on the planet, and we have to find ways to feed them. And people are looking at alternative food sources. So in many parts of the world, people eat insects. In Australia, we don't. And so there is a hotel in Perth. There's a restaurant in Perth where you can eat fried crickets. And I thought I should try that just to see what it's like, because a lot of the world does eat that. And people are looking at alternative food sources. When you're also looking at people and the way that people have been affected by the pandemic, as I said at the start, we're not all in the same boat, we're in the same storm, and there's been a rise in mental health issues around the world. But again, it's not for everybody equally. When we look at technology, things like artificial intelligence are just growing. So artificial intelligence and machine learning are really growing. And it doesn't matter what industry you work in, what business you work in, AI, machine learning, robotics, and this other thing, which is sensors, the Internet of Things. We've got devices which are gathering information and sending them to computers which are powered by artificial intelligence. That's going to drive and assist humans in a lot of areas. And in some ways, it's going to be good because it's going to make us more effective, more efficient, but it doesn't always mean that it's good. It has some negative consequences as well. And so sometimes introducing robots into a workplace doesn't mean that it's universally going to be positive. Okay, so there are some problems with this. And so we shouldn't assume that everything that happens with technology is going to be good. It's not always that way. There's some problems that we need to fix around that as well. If you start looking at economic, and I really want to focus on the Philippines around this, first something that applies around the world, people are looking at their supply chains and they're saying, if you have just-in-time supply chains, so they're very efficient, now customers are saying, we also want just in case. So they want to know that you've got backup plans and you've got risk mitigation strategies for your supply chains. So if you work in any sort of distribution or part of a supply chain process, this is going to be really important for you. But I think if you look globally, this is where the Philippines is really going to shine. So if you look at the world's biggest economies, so for most of the last 50 years, the world's biggest economies have been these 7 countries, the G7. So the USA and Canada, the UK, France, Italy, Germany, and Japan. Okay, but look at that green circle there. So at the moment, the world's population, if you look at it, there are more people living inside that circle than outside it. Okay, so you've got countries which are also going to have economic power in the not too distant future. So by 2030, which is only 10 years away, we're going to have, as much as we have the G7, they're going to be these emerging markets called the E7, which are going to share economic power with they're going to be just as powerful as the G7. So there's Brazil and Mexico, Turkey and Russia, India, China, and Indonesia. So that's in 10 years' time, we're going to have that economic power is going to be distributed differently. And then 20 years after that, the G7's power will have faded. And we're going to have these 7 other countries, which are called the frontier markets, or the F7, which are also going to share that economic power. So we've got Peru and Colombia, Nigeria and Morocco, Bangladesh, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So you can imagine that in a generation from now, the Philippines is going to be a world economic power. So it may not see that there's some time to get to that point yet, because the G7 still control most of the world's economy, but this is what our future is going to look like. The other thing that's really important for the Philippines is that it's in the world's best time zone. So if you break up the world into, if you think of this as 24 different time zones, then the world's best time zones, so you've got 24 different time zones, and you look at the time zones with the biggest number of people, the world's best time zone, which has the biggest population, is the one that has the Philippines in it. So it's big because of China. It's also where I come from Perth, Western Australia. It's also, we're all part of the world's biggest time zone in the future. So that's going to be really important for us as we're looking as the short to medium term, as how the world's economy is going to change, how power is going to change in the world. Okay, so I know I went through some of these really quickly, but this is the PESTLE process. So what you do is you sit down with your team and you say, let's go through each of these 6 areas: political, environmental, social, technological, legal, economic, and just ask for ideas and then say, is that going to have an impact on our business or on our association? Okay, I'm going to stop for questions in about a minute, but I also want to say that I was talking to Bobby when we were first talking about putting this together, and I want to give you more information than I can cover just in this 1 hour together. So if you'd like a copy of my book, The Future of Leadership, a digital copy, completely free, compliments of me and Bobby and the team, then go to this website here, gettalk.at, and it's very simple. You can do it on your phone or you can do it on your computer and type in, it'll ask you for a keyword. And if you type in the keyword leadership, then immediately, then you'll get a copy of my book, The Future of Leadership. Or you can, right now, if you want to, if you've got your phone, you can hold your camera up to this QR code and it'll go to that page straight away. So if you want to do that, then please do that. And it's there with my compliments. It'll go through some of these ideas I'm sharing with you in more detail. I think it's an essential book for leaders. And if you've got other leaders in your team as well, please feel free to share it with them as well. Okay, let me stop for questions and see if there's questions coming through. As I said, if you don't type questions in the chat or the Q&A, I'm happy to continue and take questions later. But if there are questions in the chat or the Q&A, then I'll answer them now. Okay, so let me see. There's a Q&A question here. So Ritzi says that the pandemic changed the process or mindset of Pestle. See, the nice thing about Pestle is that you can use it at any time. So what I've found is that, say 3 years ago, when I was doing pestle analysis, everybody focused on tea because tea is about technology. So everyone was obsessed about what new technology is going to affect us. How's artificial intelligence going to change us? And now technology is still important, by the way, and it really is. But now people are looking broader and they're looking at things like political, so what's the government doing, and legal, what regulations do we have to follow? They're looking at the environmental, the pandemic. So one, I don't like to say the pandemic has caused a lot of positive things, but one thing that it has done is just got people thinking wider. So, there's some industries like financial planning and some of those financial industries which are very highly regulated. So in the past, they would look at legal and regulation. Now they're looking more broadly. So it has changed it, but it's a really flexible tool, which is why I like to use it because it works for anybody. Anonymous attendee says, great presentation. During this pandemic, association members are on survival mode, and the last thing is to talk to the association. Creatively engaged members, that's coming up next. Okay, so we're going to talk about that. How big a team do you recommend to do a pestle? And what unique attributes do you recommend participants to have? So I'm going to actually touch on this later as well, but I'll answer this here. So I reckon the pestle people are the size of the team is how many you could comfortably fit into a boardroom or a meeting room. Now, you don't have to do it in person, and I've done pestle analysis with people online as well. But if you're thinking about 6 to 8 people, that's probably about right. If you're thinking 20 people, it might be too many. So that's the way to do it. And the question about the unique, let me just see the question again. What are the unique attributes? I reckon having as diverse a team as possible doing it is a good idea. So there's a temptation to only get your senior leadership to do it, or to get your association executive to do it, because of course we're the leaders. We should be doing this because that then it's going to lead to a strategic plan. I don't fall into that temptation. Get people from different areas of the organization, some junior people, some senior people, people who've been in the organization for a while, and so on. I'll talk about that later as well, actually. We'll talk about that when we get to the third area, which is about use and leverage. Okay, excellent. Thank you. Okay, great to see the questions, by the way. I really appreciate that. I have prepared more material than I need. So if there are no questions, then I will just do the extra material. But if there are questions, then I'm happy to skip that extra material, because I would rather answer your questions than go through my material. So that's the first area, which is all about how do you scan wider. The second area, and this relates to the question, the person who asked the anonymous question, which is how do we engage with people? And the rule is always, always, always follow your customer. So you can look wide and you can figure out all these things that are going to happen politically and with the pandemic and with vaccines, but you can't choose to follow all of them. So if you're thinking about what's important, follow your customer, which in the case of associations, of course, means follow your members. So find out what your members want and engage with them. In fact, I'm doing another presentation in 2 weeks' time for the Professional Conference Organizers Association in Australia, and I'm running a session all about this. It's all about customers on your side. In other words, customers and clients on your side, and in this case, that means members. So let me share with you this quotation. So this quotation is from the head of Google's global education, and he says that when he goes and talks to school kids, he talks to school groups, and he says he never asks them, what do you want to be when you grow up? he always asks them, what problem do you want to solve? And I think we should be doing the same thing. We should always be asking, what problems are we going to solve for our members? And just be aware that those problems might have changed now as a result of the pandemic. And even if your association hasn't been hard hit by the pandemic, there's a good chance that your members have. You get the distinction? So there are many associations who have really stepped up and really done a great job in helping their members. So for me, my professional association, which is Professional Speakers Australia, has done a fantastic job helping many of us adapt to this kind of like online presentations, because in-person events were closed down. So they've done a great job, because many members have really been hit hard by it. So figure out what their problems are. So let me give you an example of that. I think a company that does this really well is Netflix. So we all know Netflix now as a streaming media service, but it didn't start life doing streaming media. Netflix started off as a DVD rental service. So they were competing with Blockbuster in the USA, and they said they looked at what customers didn't like about Blockbuster, and there were two things that customers didn't like. They didn't like that you had to return the video after you had watched it, and they didn't like late fees. So Netflix said, how can we fix that? Well, we will provide a free return delivery service. So we'll do it by mail order, so you can order your DVDs, because they went with DVDs rather than video because it was lighter, so it was cheaper to send back, so Netflix could pay the lower cost. So it didn't cost you anything to send it back, and there were no late fees. So customers were happy, and some of them started moving to Netflix. And then people started getting better internet access, and they wanted immediate access to the movies. They didn't want to wait for Netflix to deliver their DVD in the mail. They wanted to be able to stream it. And Netflix did not say, let's make our DVD service faster. Netflix said, our customers want this online, so let's throw away our DVD service and completely change our business model to offer what our customers wanted. And not only the customers, but also TV and movie companies that were licensing material. They loved Netflix, because now here's another way you could earn royalties every time somebody watched a movie. They liked it at first, and then they saw Netflix was growing too fast, and it was a really big competitor, and it was actually damaging some of their other places where people wouldn't go to the movies, they wouldn't go to the cinema anymore because they watched it at home. So they stopped licensing their material to Netflix. And Netflix said, that's okay. We still want to follow what our customers want, and our customers still want content, and they still want their streaming. So now we will build our own studio in Hollywood, and we will create our own content. And that's what Netflix has done now. They've just said all along, we will follow our customers and we will just do whatever they want, because that's how we will stay relevant for them. So I'm going to give you some examples from a couple of other industries as well. And before we do that, let me ask you, I've got a bit of a puzzle for you here. So this puzzle is a little bit of a logic question. So you can see here car park, and the parking spaces are numbered. And there is a pattern to the way that the spaces are numbered. So my question for you, and I'm going to ask you to type it in the chat, is that you can see that the car has come in and has hidden and parked in a spot, and it's hidden the number. So my question for you is, what is the number of that parking space that you can't see? So if you figure out the pattern, you'll know what that number is. So I'm going to see what people are typing in chat. Okay, so have a go, have a guess. And as people are typing it in, I'll give you some idea of how people are going with their guesses. So some people have seen this before, and then you know the answer. Some people will get the answer straight away. Some people will take a little bit of time to get the answer. So let's see what people are typing in. So I'm just going to wait a little bit to see, because I'll give you a bit of thinking time to do this. Okay. So actually, there's been a couple of people who've typed this in privately in the chat. So let me give you the answer here. So if you haven't already got the answer, let me give you a hint. Okay, what if I did this? What if I turned this around like this? Now, do you see what the answer is? Now, everyone would say, and thank you to the people who already replied, 87, who already got the answer before I gave you the hint. But now it's obvious, isn't it? And sometimes it takes a change in perspective to get the right solution. And that's what I mean by following your customer, understanding what your customer wants differently and has and needs differently. And of course, for associations, what do members want and need differently? So let me give you some examples from the, I'll pick the airline industry because that's an industry that's been really hard hit by the pandemic and has had to be really creative to go back to its customers and loyal flyers to find out what they want. So for example, Emirates was one of the first airlines to offer health insurance for COVID-19 for anybody flying Emirates. So if you're flying Emirates and you test positive for COVID-19, then Emirates health insurance will cover you. Here in Australia, if you fly into the country, then you have to quarantine in a hotel for 2 weeks and you have to pay the cost of the hotel quarantine. But if you're flying Emirates, Emirates will pay that hotel cost for you. So Emirates is looking for ways that they can make this more attractive to people, for people to fly Emirates. So that's just one example of an airline that's done something slightly different and slightly creative. Here in Australia as well, we had Qantas, which is our national airline. A few weeks ago, they had a flight to nowhere. So it took off from Sydney, it flew around Australia for 7 hours, and there's some beautiful landmarks on the eastern side of Australia. So it flew low so people could look at the landmarks and then came back. A 7-hour flight. And it sold out in 10 minutes from the time they announced it and opened up for tickets. It sold out in 10 minutes, even though for most people, actually getting to the destination, doing a long flight and getting home, that's the worst part of going on a holiday. But people's priorities have changed. And Qantas said, let's find out what our customers want and let's offer something to them. Closer to home for you, in Singapore Airlines, they also thought about the idea of a flight to nowhere, but they didn't do that. What they did instead was they said, this is a funny idea. I think it's funny, but this is another idea that they had, which sold out almost immediately. So 2 of the big Singapore Airlines A380s were sitting on the tarmac at Changi Airport, and they opened it up and you could book a seat on that, not for the flight, but you could book to get on the plane and eat airline food. So you had 3 choices if you want an economy class meal, a business class meal, or a first class meal, and then you book. And so one weekend, they had these 2 planes on the tarmac, which were open for people to just go and sit and have an airline meal because they couldn't get the whole experience of flying, but Singapore Airlines could offer them this alternative. If you didn't want to get on, if you thought that was a crazy idea, Singapore Airlines also did something for the sort of people who would normally fly first class on Singapore Airlines. What you could do if you're in Singapore, you could pay Singapore Airlines to send a chef to your home, and for a meal for 2, so for you and your partner, you could have a chef come and home cook a fine dining meal for you, the sort of meal that you would get if you were flying first class in Singapore Airlines. And you would get fine wines, Dom Perignon champagne. It's all served on beautiful Wedgwood china, which you get to keep. And for that, it only costs you $900 for that meal. And you get a bit of a discount if you return the china at the end of the process. But this just proves that people are looking for experiences, and these are some things that you think are crazy and you would never do, but things have changed and people are looking at different priorities now. They want different things from their providers, and the same thing applies to associations as well. So people want the members want different things from you now, and they might not be the same things that you assume that they wanted in the past. Let me just see if there's any questions around that, because I'm happy to answer questions around that at this point. Okay, I think so. I think Lisa's responding to my puzzle there. Okay, good. Okay, let me continue. Oh, there's something Q&A. Let me have a look. What advice would you give to APAC-based organizations to be the blue ocean for global associations? Markers of, yeah, so look, I think this is a really interesting question. It's probably a wider question than I can cover here. But I think one of the things that's happened, and many people haven't figured this out yet, is that we are more global now. So for example, I'm in Perth, Western Australia. As part of my professional association, I would normally attend my monthly chapter meetings in Perth. But now the association, because of the pandemic, everybody had to go and have online meetings now. Australia's opening up quite a lot now, so many people are now going back and we can have safe meetings in person. But as a result of the pandemic, all the chapters around Australia made all their meetings online, which also meant that it was easy for anybody around the country to attend meetings in other parts of the country. Also, the Singapore Association of Professional Speakers, they run monthly meetings, monthly chapter meetings, and they've opened that up to Australian members as well. So every month, last night, in fact, I attended the November meeting of the Singapore Speakers Association. Now, I would never fly to Singapore every month to do that. But because it's online, I'm able to do that easily from my home office. And there's some real opportunities here for organizations. And I think, that map that I showed you with half the people's world's population lives inside that circle. I think in APAC, we're really, really well placed in the time zone that we've got, and most of the world's population concentrated in this area. There's some huge opportunities if we take advantage of online opportunities. This summit is a perfect example, and I'm just awestruck by what a magnificent job that Bobby and Charlie and the team have done to put this together and make it a truly international summit. And it has been in the past, but it's even more international now because it's broken down those barriers of distance. And so if I was to give you one piece of advice, think not just distance, but think time zone as well, because there's so many people in our time zone or close time zones that we can take advantage of that. Okay, any other questions? I don't see any others coming in. If there are, ask away. I will stop once more for questions because we've got about 20 minutes to go, and I will stop about 5 minutes before the end for any last questions that you've got. But thank you, Ritzi, for that question. Okay, so let's look at this third area. This third area here, and this kind of touches on something that somebody asked before about who do you include in your team when you're thinking about pestle analysis and so on. So I want to say to you that we've talked about scanning wide, which is really important and a really good thing to do. We talked about you then narrowing it down to choose what path you're going to take. And the biggest filter for you should be, what do our members want? So do whatever you can to engage with your members to find out what they want. And I promise I'll give you some ideas. So the simple thing to do is to send out an email survey, but don't stop at that. So you send out an email survey. Based on the responses, then you may choose to contact people individually. You might also choose to host just an online forum for members to just have a conversation about what's most important to them. And there's some ways to facilitate that, and I'm sure that you've already got skilled facilitators who can lead that kind of forum. But my key point is, don't assume that you know what people want, because what people want now might be different than what they want in the future. Okay, so let's look at this third area, and this is like really leveraging your team. And in your team here, I'm talking about your immediate team. So it might be your executive team, if you're leader of an association, it might be your business team, but it goes beyond that as well. So this is internal rather than external. Again, I've got a question for you, and another little bit of a puzzle. So this is based on some fact. So my question for you, and I'd like you to answer in the chat, is what do these 4 companies have in common? Okay, so the four companies are this: Groupon. So Groupon, we know it's big. It's marketing and promotions. They do vouchers, and so it's a really big company, especially in the US. And there's some other competitors, but still, Groupon's one of the biggest that's there. The second one is Slack. So Slack's a software company. You may be using it already. A few years ago, it was one of the fastest growing companies in the world, and it's like an alternative to email. Uber, which we all know for ride sharing and other services, services like that, and then spun off things like Ola as well, and WhatsApp, which we all know for chat and messaging. So my question for you is, what do those four companies have in common? So I'm going to give you a few seconds to type in the chat room, what do those four companies have in common? And if you're not sure what all four have, just think about what maybe three of them have in common, or two of them, because it might apply to the others as well. By the way, there's more than one right answer to this question. So there's not only one right answer. So, so sometimes people say to me, they're all digital companies, which is true. Sometimes people say to me they don't have physical assets. So that's true, like Uber and Ola, they don't own taxis, they don't employ drivers, but they facilitate that. Some people say they're disruptive companies, which is true, and that's part of the reason I want as well. Krista says online platform. Yeah, they don't have an actual physical product. Yeah, this is good. Discount services, good. I'm waiting for other answers. So all of these answers are right, by the way, but there's one other answer that I want to share with you. They answered a need of customers and create a new and thriving business. They absolutely did answer a need. Yet became part of our lives. In fact, Ritzi, you said that they became part of our lives. I was working with a leadership team recently, and one of the senior leaders, she said to me, these are all things that my kids can't live without, because she's got Generation Z kids, right? So yes, absolutely true. Okay, there's one other thing that all of these companies have in common. So thank you very much for playing along and participating. But there's one other thing that these companies have in common, and it's that they were all founded during the global financial crisis, the GFC. And the GFC affected, again, lots of the world in lots of different ways. It was particularly bad in the US and in North America in general, and in Europe. In fact, in the USA, they called the global financial crisis, they called it the Great Recession, because it had such a big impact. And yet, all of these companies were started during that global financial crisis, and they still exist today. Now, I'm not telling you this because I'm a motivation speaker, you should do the same. Every crisis creates opportunity. If they can do it, you can. That's not my message here. Those things might be true, but that's not the reason I'm saying this. The reason I'm saying this is because all of these companies were disruptors, and they are disruptors. The thing is this, that when there's a crisis and when there's change and when there's disruption, easier for competitors to come in. So I know in the Philippines, early in the pandemic, the research that was done said that there were three groups really. Like if you looked at business people in the Philippines, 1/3 of them said we're not really affected by the pandemic. 1/3 said we're really badly affected. And there was the other third said we're kind of moderately affected by it. But it's really easy, especially if you're in that first third that wasn't badly affected by it, to be really complacent and say we're lucky that it didn't affect us. But what's happened is that it's still caused some disruption to your customers, to your members, to the community. It's like if you're driving and a stone hits your windscreen but doesn't shatter it, it might just be a little crack, but it's dangerous to keep driving, because it's not that stone that's dangerous, it's the next one that comes along is now going to shatter the windscreen, because the first thing made it more brittle and fragile. And so that's a real risk that we face, that even if things are looking good again, we've still got to be careful, because people's priorities and what matters to them has changed. Because see, what happens is when things are going well, we tend not to worry too much about little things. So we don't mind little problems. We'll just tolerate them. So if it takes a long time to get somewhere, we'll go, that's okay, that's just normal. It's too much effort to change. If we don't like our providers, then we'll say, that's okay, look, it's too much, it's too difficult to change our providers. But when there's a crisis and everybody is reevaluating everything, that's when these sort of things make a difference. And I think this applies to your team as well. So if you want to build a team that's strong in times of crisis and change, then I reckon there's one thing that you should really do, and that is to really embrace this idea of diversity. of having people in your team who've come from different backgrounds, different ways of thinking, different age, different generation, different gender, and have all of that in your team. Because then it means that if something crazy happens, some random event happens, there may be somebody else in your team who you may not have thought of as being a problem solver, who then steps up and says, we can do this. And if something else happens, then you can say, we can do this. There's a real trap if you're a leader, and especially if you're an experienced leader. The trap is to think that you've got all the answers and that you have to have all the answers. The answers that worked for you in the past might not work for you in the future. So just be careful that you don't automatically assume that just because you've got the experience, you've got all the answers. That diversity is really important. As one of my clients, Dr. Nikki Howe, she's the CEO of an aged care facility here in Perth in Australia. She said this: didn't you employ knowledge workers for their knowledge? So you really want to tap into their skills and knowledge and expertise. And one of the best ways that you can do this, and we can all do this, regardless of what leadership role we have, regardless of what's happening in the organization, we can all do this, and that's with mentoring. And there's two kinds of mentoring. So the first kind of mentoring is the one that you might know already, which is a more senior person in the organization mentors a more junior person. Because if you're a leader, if you've got a lot of experience, you might be mentoring people because you can share your experience with them. It helps them build up their judgment, and eventually they become wise leaders like you are. Okay, that's a traditional way of mentoring. I think you should definitely do that, but I think you should also consider the opposite of that, which is called reverse mentoring. So this photo here is Janet Wilson, who's one of my clients. Actually, she's no longer a client because she retired from her business 2 years ago. So she was the CEO of a law practice in Brisbane in Australia. And she used to do this reverse mentoring. So every 6 months, she would choose somebody in her organization who was junior, and that person would be the mentor. So Janet would learn from this person. And junior meant one of three things. It could have actually been junior by age, so somebody who was younger. It could have been junior by experience in the business. So maybe somebody they've employed recently in the law business, even if they had a lot of experience elsewhere. Or it could be junior in law. So somebody who's recently graduated from university with a law degree, because Janet was interested in knowing what our university is teaching now. And she would have conversations with them. She'd just have a coffee, or they'd meet in her office every week or every 2 weeks. And she said the conversations are always inspirational, sometimes worrying. She always keeps it informal, and she gives a mentor permission, this more junior person, permission to speak freely. And that's the most important thing you can do. And Janet's role is to be the student, to be the learner, rather than her usual role is to be the teacher and the mentor and the wise leader. So can you do this kind of reverse mentoring with your team as well? So choose somebody who's junior to you to be your teacher. And it's a really powerful thing. You can make it work if you're humble enough to say, I've got things that I could learn. And if you create the permission for that more junior person to be the mentor and to speak freely. So in my business, I run a very small business. It's just myself and my business manager, Emma. So we both live in Perth, but we don't work in an office together. So I work from home, Emma works from home. And when we first started working together 3 years ago, Emma said to me, she said, GIHAN, you know, we seem to use a lot of email between us when you want me to do something. And I said, yeah, that's good, because we don't have to pick up the phone all the time. We don't have to be sending messages all the time. And she said, yeah, that's good, but we should be using Slack and Trello. And I said, okay, Em, I've heard of Slack. It was one of the fastest growing companies at the time. I tried Trello with somebody else that I was working with before you came on board. We couldn't really get it to work, but look, if you think that we should be using that, then tell me how to use it. So you set it up, you set up the workflows and tell me how to use it. And as a result, we don't use Slack. It didn't quite suit our work style, but we use Trello every day now. It's a really powerful tool for us. And we use it all the time instead of email. Now, I'm not telling you this because I want you to use Slack and Trello. I'm telling you this because I want you to get the idea of having a reverse mentor. So have somebody who has different, comes from a different gives you a different perspective. So the reverse mentoring is, as I said, the junior person mentors the more senior person, because that more junior person has different experiences, they've got different expertise, and it's not just about technology necessarily, they've got lots of other expertise, and they bring a completely different perspective. So if you're thinking about how do we build a more robust organization in this uncertain time, think about reverse mentoring. Okay, I want to stop, and this is my last chance to stop and have questions. So if you've got any questions, please ask. I can see some coming in. Yeah, Ritzy says, my millennial children are my reverse mentors. I learned a lot from them. So I don't have children, but I have 2 stepchildren. And absolutely, I think the same thing. So my stepdaughter, Abby, who's now 21, she's a fantastic mentor for me. She tells me about podcasts that she's listening to. She tells me about, she helps set up my Spotify playlist for me. She does a lot for me. And I'm always interested in having conversations with her about what's happening in her life, because that perspective is so valuable to me. Figure out online matters. And Ritzy, I think that's a really good thing that you're saying there. That so Ritzy says, because this is not everyone can see his the comments that are going to panelists. Ritzy says, my millennial children are my reverse mentors. I learn a lot from them, and they help me figure out online matters. And that's right. And just by the way, so many people look at their children and younger people to help them with digital and online, but ask them about other things as well, like what they think about job for life or home ownership or working from home or working as part of a global team, because that perspective is just as valuable as their actual skills. I think the thing that you get most is perspective from your reverse mentors. And it doesn't mean that you have to have the same person all the time. Of course you do with your kids. You're not going to swap your children with some other family, but in a professional context, you may choose, like Janet did, to use different mentors at different times. So Janet would change her mentor every 3 to 6 months. And it was easy. Once people found out that she was sincere about it and she genuinely wanted to learn, there were many people who were happy and they would love to volunteer to be her mentor for that 3 or 6 months. Okay, let me just see other questions. I agree with the need to embrace diversity in organizations, Philip says. Where do you see challenges that come with diversity? The thing, Philip, is that there are a lot of challenges that come with diversity, and a lot of those challenges are just based on a perception that because we're leaders and we're experienced, that we know best. And if somebody has an idea that's a little bit different from us, it's easy to judge that too quickly. In fact, let me show you this slide here while we're talking about that. This is one of the spare slides that I had, just in case we didn't have any questions, but thank you for asking the questions. So this is one of the things that I share with people. I say, if you're a leader, and just be careful of saying things like this. If somebody has an idea, it's very easy to respond with one of these things. Oh, we tried that once, but it didn't work. That would never work here. We're too busy. It's not in the association's charter or the constitution. It's not part of your job, or we'll leave that till the next year's committee. And those sort of things get in the way of change and innovation. And also, if you say these things, there are 2 things I want to say about this. All of these things might be true, or any of these things might be true. So if you say, we tried that once, but it didn't work, that might be true. You're not trying to stifle innovation. You're just sharing something that happened in the past, so you don't want to waste time on it again. But if all you do is come up with objections, you create this culture where people will stop sharing their ideas. And especially when you've got a diverse team, they'll stop sharing their unique ideas, because they'll say, GIHAN's only interested in the ideas that are the sort of ideas he'd think of. So you kind of squash that diversity and you narrow it, and you don't have that inclusion. So, people talk about diversity and inclusion. So diversity is like having a lot of colored pencils. Inclusion is actually using them when you're creating something. And a lot of people just tick the diversity box, and we say, we've got a diverse team. But if you're not actually using their ideas, then you haven't got the inclusion part of it. You says, can you do a combination of reverse and senior mentoring? Yeah, absolutely you can. Absolutely. And I think for all of us, there are opportunities for us to be a mentor and also to be mentored. And it can be in both directions. So absolutely you should do this. And the reason I picked on mentoring, because there's lots of things that we could talk about when it comes to learning and development, but mentoring is so easy. All you need are two people. You don't need a HR team. You don't need a formal learning and development process. You don't need this to be part of key performance indicators and performance reviews. You just get together with one other person and say, will you be my mentor? Or would you like a mentor? And so it's very easy to set up, which is one of the reasons that I want to share that here. Okay, let me just quickly check before we finish up. Any other questions? So Lisa says, I'd love to get the 10 ways to stop change slide. So the recording of this presentation, as I think the recordings of all the presentations from the summit, are going to go out to attendees. I think that's right. I hope I've said the right thing there, Bobby. So you're welcome to just watch the recording and you copy these ideas. So, I came up with this list of 10. So officially speaking, this is my list of 10, but it's not unique. I got these ideas from just looking around and I've made up a list of 10. So feel free to take those ideas and just share them with your team or share them within your group as well. And so quite often when I teach this, I show them this slide, I show leaders this slide and I say, how many of these things have you said or have you heard in workplaces? And if they're really brave, you get the leaders to go to their teams and say, how many of these things have you heard me say? So in other words, what am I doing that's stopping innovation and diversity and inclusion in the team? And brave leaders will do that. And leaders who want to be open and transparent and authentic will do that. Okay, let's continue just to finish up. So I want to so we talked about three things broadly. So we talked about this idea when we're talking about leading with agility, we talked about scanning wider. So get an idea of your external circumstances that might have an impact on you. We talked about then narrowing it down and specifically about following your customer. And finally, how do you leverage the resources of your team? So I want to give you one last process that's really useful when we're talking about leading in uncertainty. And it's about better decision making, because we still have a lot of uncertainty in our world. And wherever you are in the world, there's that uncertainty is going to continue for a while. Some countries have done better than others with coping with this pandemic. I feel very fortunate that I live in Australia, which is has done incredibly well, one of the most successful countries in dealing with the pandemic, but still there's a lot of economic uncertainty and social uncertainty. So I want to share with you this one process that you can use to help make better decisions in uncertainty. And it comes from this book by Chip and Dan Heath, who've written about how to make better decisions in general. And this is research-based strategies for decision making. And I've adapted one of the ideas so it'll work, so it applies particularly in uncertainty. And it goes like this. So what you're going to do is ask your future self for advice. So here we are now, and I'd like you to think about a time in the 3 times in the future: short term, medium term, and long term. The exact numbers don't matter, but let's just say for this exercise, short term is 10 weeks, medium term is 10 months, and long term might be 10 years. It doesn't matter. You can choose something different. You might choose a short term is 4 weeks, medium term is a year, and long term is 5 years. It doesn't matter. Choose what's relevant for you. And then imagine that you are that future version of you at each of those 3 time frames. So let's take the 10 months. So you imagine that you, the future you in 10 months, is now looking back at now and saying to you now, thank you, thank you, thank you. I'm so grateful for the decisions that you made and the actions that you took 10 months ago that got me and us to where we are now. Then you ask yourself, what were those decisions? What were those actions? It's a very simple exercise, and it might sound like it's just this mental trick that you're doing, but it's so useful to give yourself clarity, because what it does, it gives you a perspective and it helps you take the next step. So again, if you haven't already got the book, please download it with my compliments. Just go to gettalk.at. If you want to take a screenshot of this screen now, I'll make sure that that link stays there for the rest of the conference, so you don't have to get it immediately. My last message to you is this: don't wait for everything to be perfect. If 2020 has taught us anything, it's that if you're waiting for perfection, it's not going to happen. Things are going to change. So start before you're ready and take action. Thanks everyone for taking part. If you want to get in touch with me, all my contact details are at my website. Enjoy the rest of the conference. I'll be around for some of the other sessions as well. So if you see me in any of the sessions, please say hello. In the meantime, stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you in the future. Thanks everyone.
Thank you so much, Gihan. You know, I've been almost overwhelmed, and I've been a fan of yours. I've attended maybe 5 or 6 of your webinars in the past few months. So thank you so much for your always insightful, inspiring, informative presentations, and also interactive, by the way. And the stories telling is very fantastic. So on behalf of our PCIe Board of Trustees and our Secretariat, thank you so much. Really appreciate your speaking in this summit. And but I owe you something, because your portrait and the certificate is not yet ready, but we will send it to you just like what we did with our tourism head,
Thanks very much.
tourism board head. So thank you so much, Gihan. We'll keep in touch, and all the best. And thank you
Thanks,
so
Boris.
much.
And thanks,
Thank you so
everyone.
much.